Hello everyone and welcome back to this second video in this series of tutorials that I'm publishing. I'm Estefania from Gaming with Estefania, and in this tutorial we are going to dive into the settings or options of the sculpting terrain tools. In the last video we saw all the 8 sculpting terrain tools and we saw exactly what they did and how they affected or modified the terrain. Here we have some of our results from the terrain sculpting tutorial, but now let's focus on the settings. The first setting that we can find over here is intensity. Intensity is exactly what the word means, the intensity of the change that will occur in the terrain. So for example, if I want to pull the terrain to create a mountain, you can see that the change is quite drastic, because right now we have that setting at 100%. Very rapidly, you can see that the terrain is modified in a very intense way. But now, if let's say I lower this to 30%, now the effect takes quite some time to even be noticeable, because we have the setting very low. This is very helpful to create more subtle effects on the terrain, more subtle modifications. The same applies to all the other tools, like push. You can see that I am creating a really subtle valley or sunken area here. It works with all of these tools. Awesome, so now that you know the intensity option, now let's go to the size option. Whenever we have a terrain sculpting tool selected, we will see a white circle around it. This white circle tells us the area where the tool will have an effect on the terrain. If we want to pull the terrain, we will see that the effect is applied to the area within that white circle, right? You can see it right here. If we increase the intensity to 100% over here, we can see it even better, like this. The effect of this tool stays within the boundaries of the circle, within the white circle. You can change the size of this circle with the size setting. Right now it's at 16, the highest value that you can set is 20, and the smallest value that you can set is 1. So look at this little circle over here, so tiny. That is, of course, well, just for very small modifications of the terrain. Usually we use a number somewhere in between, like 8. It really depends on the size of our habitat and what we are trying to do, and that combined with the intensity can create some very powerful terrain sculpting effects. Awesome, so now you know these 2 settings, so let's go to scenery lock. Scenery means just anything that you can put on the ground here, from the nature, facilities, or habitat, or barriers. Anything that you plot on the ground, you can consider that a scenery. For example, let's say that we have some rocks over here. We put down some rocks like this. And now let's say that we use the terrain sculpting tools in this area where we have our scenery. If we don't have scenery lock enabled, then this is what will happen if we try to create a mountain. Look at this. The terrain doesn't really respect, or it's not even aware of the fact that we have scenery items there. The terrain is just modified and the scenery items are like buried inside it, or they are just not taken into account. For example, if we just push here, look at what happens. It's like the rocks are floating in the air and the palm tree is just floating in the air. Very strange, right? That is what will happen if you don't have scenery lock enabled. Now let's flatten everything to foundation again, and now let's enable scenery lock. You will see what happens. Now if we push down, let's see what happens. Now the terrain knows that there are scenery items there. The tool knows. So we now have some sort of ground where they are right now, and the ground is floating, which is also strange, but something that we can work with the other terrain tools when we sculpt the terrain like this. But the main thing here is that the tool is detecting scenery items, and it's adjusting the terrain to create a more realistic effect. Now, if we instead pull the terrain, we will create terrain around the items like this. Look at this. Now the mountain is not actually covering the items. Of course, if we continue with this, it may cover the items, but it actually creates a space within the mountain for these items. So that is super helpful as well if you ever, for example, want to create a cave or something around some scenery items. That is super helpful. Another setting that is similar to scenery lock is surface lock. Deformation locks to the surface or not. This is another setting that you can enable or disable to enable that deformation locking to the surface or not. And another setting is paint. Paint has 3 options: auto paint, use selected, and sampled. With auto paint, when you modify or sculpt the terrain, the paint of the ground will be applied automatically. Right now, since we have long grass, you can see that the mountain has that same paint, that same texture of long grass. But let's say that now, instead of auto paint, I select use selected. And then I choose a different paint, like for example, let's say rock rough. Now if I create a mountain, the mountain will have that particular paint applied automatically. So you can save yourself some time and paint the terrain as you sculpt it. So it's really, really helpful. And you also have the option sampled, which also takes a sample of the terrain. For example, here you can pull the terrain and you can see that you have some long grass over here, and you also have the rocks over here as a continuation. If we didn't have this sampled option selected, you can see that the mountain will automatically have just one paint, just the long grass. It will only apply long grass because that is how the paint is applied automatically. But if we choose sampled, we will be keeping the paint that is already on the ground when we modify the terrain. That is the difference between these options. I really like the sampled option because it already keeps the paint that you applied on the terrain. Okay, but they're all super helpful. Awesome, and we also have these 2 options, highlight hidden barriers and highlight hidden paths, and those options are very helpful to see the barriers and paths that you may have close to the terrain that you are modifying. So for example, let's say that I create a null barrier over here, which are null barriers that you don't actually see. They're very helpful to create natural barriers like water or cliffs or other types of barriers that you can customize and use for your habitats. Here you can see the hidden barriers. Let's also plot some null paths that you cannot see. For example, something like this. Okay, we have this path over here, and if we just close these tools, we will not see them. But if we go into the terrain tool, we will be able to see them if we have this option selected, all or nearby, which will show you the barriers and the paths that are close to the terrain that you are modifying. You can also select off if you don't want to show any barriers or paths on the terrain that you're modifying, but it's usually helpful to see them, so by default you will see them all. Awesome, so now we covered all these settings that we have over here. Flattened Tutorials has another set of settings. It has like 2 more settings over here that we can customize, but we will cover that in another tutorial in this series. So stay tuned, I will publish that and share that on my channel. Awesome, in the coming tutorials we will talk about the terrain stamp tool. We will also talk about painting and how you can paint the terrain, and we will talk about water because there is a lot to cover about water. It has many different details. Thank you for watching, have a great day.